Kind of with my travel schedule, I generally am not around. So it started in tomorrow and did an exit.
He's got a few that are in his house now.
So you're in where are you from? Chapel?
I'm not in the there on
private lives that it's freezing up there. So I've been to Lake Placid. That's my Adirondack experience. Awesome. Do you like cold weather?
So here we live in Atlanta. I've been living since 2004.
I can't remember his name. Usually it goes from like sweltering hot to cold. What we do is Halloween. That's about the time. Right. It's been real rough. Promotion.
Holiday lights. Oh my gosh, it's like a whole
around Charlotte, back here most of the maybe 8 Yeah, so I used to practice all the executive coaching. Jerry,
how are you? I'm still on your contract. So I told you last Friday what you were back to test a couple.
where's the bell?
I think so.
Of the folks who around speaking, coaching, all that.
Welcome. Welcome to another beautiful day here at East Chapel Hill Road. We're having a little rough day here at East Chapel Hill Rotary. Omar is not in town, and so he asked Mike Clayton to take charge, and Mike's brother-in-law, Debbie's brother, unfortunately passed away this week, so he's out of town, so he asked me to take charge. I got here today, prepared, ready to go, and I asked Tim, where's the bell? No bell. I asked him, who's the sergeant of arms? No sergeant of arms. I asked him to give me the list, the guest list. He's kind of one, but it's not actually really. Rob just asked who's here. So this is all on the fly, okay? But the thing that we've got going for us is two things. First of all, Tim's focus, he forgot everything else, but one thing he didn't forget was the fine basket. You see that? But also we've got a fantastic speaker today. And we are gonna use as much time to have him speak rather than you listening to me. But to get us, well, I tell you, I just lobbed that softball right out there. And I thank you for taking it. To get us started today, I would like to ask President number 50, Bob Ward, to bless our group.
What?
Yes, you are.
Most Lord, dear Lord, we thank you once again for bringing us together. Keep us aware of the words, truth, fellowship, friendship, goodwill, and official law. Bless us through the immersion in our bodies, and us to your service.
Thank you, Bob. Well, we've got the World Series going on, but we've got our first basketball game tonight, right? The Hurricanes are playing tonight, and the Tar Heel football team is playing a very important game tomorrow night. We are incredibly 6-1, undefeated in conference, and most people think if we win tomorrow, we're going to the ACC championship. Now, one thing I got to tell you is that I bought 4 seats for the ACC championship this week, so you probably should expect them to lose tomorrow, because it's a kiss of death when I do that. I have been remiss in wearing my Rotary pin, and so I'm going to pass the basket around today. For anyone who's not wearing their Rotary pin, please put in $1. This should be quite a full basket at the end. And Tim, who is the charity that the money's going to today? Thank you for your preparation. Well done. We are going to, because Jennifer Player got our speaker today, all the money today is going to go to the Habitat for Humanity. All right, so we're going to pass the basket around, maybe dig in a little deeper. All right. Who's going to the game? Raise your hands to the basketball game tonight. Basketball game, first of all, exhibition. Who's going to the Hurricanes game tonight? I am. You are? I'll see you there. And who's going to the football game tomorrow? All right, let's go Heels. Do we have any guests here today? I'm going to start here and see if we have any guests at this table.
Yeah, my friend and neighbor Scott Lawson. Hello.
Scott, I think you've been here before.
Thank you.
Jennifer?
Yep, and I have our speaker, Duncan Sands, whom you'll get to meet, and my college roommate of all 4 years here at UNC, Liz Irby.
I'm Dr. Jim Kurz from Carolina Clinic. Some of you may know him. You've seen his police poster for when he was at Virginia Tech. He got arrested a few times, but he's trying to reform. It's his second visit with us.
Very good. Very good. You know, they say criminals associate with other criminals, so you're in good shape. Oh,
yeah.
Jennifer, you need to donate heavily to the Vine Basket because you forgot to introduce who?
Sorry, my husband's also here. Done.
Yes, sir.
Two guests, Ms. Sandra Henson and Sherry Florian Grace. They're wanting to hear the guest speaker today, and so when I told her, she said, "Can I go?" I said, "Come along." So,
well, it's very nice of you to invite them, bring them here, and sit at another table. Are there any other guests or visiting Rotarians today? Well, you know, Winston Churchill is a remarkable man, well known for so many things, particularly some of his humor and witticisms that always had a little grain of truth in them. And so I'm going to share one of my favorites of his that will also apply to me, which is Winston Churchill said in public speaking that a good speech is like a woman's skirt. It's long enough to cover the subject, but short enough to maintain interest. And with that, I'll ask Jennifer Player to introduce our speaker.
How do I follow that one? So good to see all of your smiling faces today, and I'm thrilled to introduce you to my friend Duncan Sands, who is with us today from Atlanta. I think he does have Winston Churchill's humor and wit, and I found out last night some of his stories are maybe not even true. So we'll see. Hopefully today they're all true for you. I was with Lori Palicelli actually earlier this week on a trip, and she asked me about my connection to Duncan. And so I'll say my friend Liz, whom I've just introduced, met Duncan in Atlanta, where they live, and to her surprise, learned about his connection, of course, to Winston Churchill. So it'll be fun to hear that today. So the bio is here in front of you, so I'm not going to go through all of it. But Duncan comes from a long line of politicians. He himself, as you'll read, was elected to Lord Mayor of Westminster, was the youngest at the age of 24, and has a very deep pride and heritage from his home country. But I will tell you what you won't read on the bio is that I have seen this man on a Carolina Shores beach with an American flag in one hand and a sparkler in the other give the most beautiful rendition of God Bless America in the most charming English-British accent. So I have video footage to prove it if anybody wants to check that out at the end of the meeting. So with that, please give a great East Chapel Hill welcome to Duncan Sands.
Well, I'm not sure whether I should say thank you to Jennifer for that introduction. She sort of set me up to say that what I'm going to say is completely untrue, and if she dares share that video footage, I'm not sure exactly what I'll do. But anyways, I'm delighted to be here today. It's the culmination of a long 2 weeks of travel that I've had. I came from New York yesterday, but anyway, I'm delighted to be here. And since I met Liz, I've been learning to love everything to do with UNC and Chapel Hill. But probably the most important thing that I've learned is what colour Duke blue is. And to make sure, in fact, my wardrobe was stripped of any shirts in that colour, and just to make sure that I never wear it at all. You've obviously, I'm sure many of you have been watching what's been going on back home in England, where we've had a tumultuous couple of months. I'm pleased to say that the grown-ups are back in charge after the previous Prime Minister sort of blew up the laboratory and nearly destroyed our economy. But obviously at the beginning of all of that, we had a moment of profound change in our country when Queen Elizabeth II died. And I just want to, and I hope I can make this thing work properly. Have I got the right?
Yeah, yes.
It's just on once. But Queen was our longest serving monarch, 70 years, the only monarch in our history to have a platinum jubilee. And her reign stretched back so far that I think probably maybe 80 to 85% of the country never knew any other monarch apart from her. And her first Prime Minister was Winston Churchill, who had come back into office in 1951. He first met the Queen in 1928 when she was just 2 years old, when he was staying at Balmoral with the King. And he wrote to his wife and he said, "Princess Elizabeth, aged 2, is a character. She has an air of authority and reflectiveness, astonishing in an infant." And as her Prime Minister, early in her reign, he told a friend in 1953, "I fear they may ask her to do too much. She's doing so well and is lovely and inspiring. All the film people in the world, if they had scoured the globe, could not have found anyone so suited to the part." And I think probably he was in love with her, as I think many of the early older male prime ministers were in those days. The photo that's on the screen was taken in April 1955 on the eve of his resignation as Prime Minister. And not long afterwards, the Queen decided to grant Churchill the signal honour of a state funeral, the only one that took place, the only non-royal one that took place in the 20th century. And in her message to Parliament on his death, the Queen described Churchill as a national hero, and at his funeral she did something that she had never done before and never did afterwards, which was that she waived protocol by arriving before his coffin at his funeral in what was an unprecedented and gracious gesture. And the card on her wreath that was on top of the coffin simply said, "From the nation and the Commonwealth in grateful remembrance." But the reason that Winston Churchill was honoured in this way was because because he was a leader of consequence. There we go. You have to tell me if I push it, it doesn't function at all. So he was seen, he was seen as a leader of consequence, and that's why he was admired. He was a student of history. He learned key lessons and how they could be applied in his own life. And today, what I want to do is to take his story and use his story for the same, and do the same for our lives. And there's 4 principles that I'll come to at the end: preparation, audacity, courage, and failure. Where's the thing for the? There we go. So most people, this is how most people know Winston Churchill as the war leader, but what they don't realise is that it wasn't destined to happen. And what we need to do is to look at his early career, really to understand how it was that he came to be prepared for that supreme task in 1940. Just click again. So professionally, he had a seamless and meteoric rise. He was in the British Army, he was a journalist, he was an author and politician. He was one of the youngest cabinet ministers at the age of 33. Still today, I think he's the second youngest that we've had. And during this time, he really exhibited natural leadership. If we can do another slide, would be great, thank you. In 1911, he was appointed as the First Lord of the Admiralty, which is in charge of the Royal Navy. And to be honest with you, I think that with how his career had gone up until then, he probably felt that he was walking on water. Until the First World War came. Obviously, we were in the First World War a few years before you were. And in 1915, he had this grand plan to invade Turkey, what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, through the Dardanelles and Gallipoli. This was a complete disaster. There was really a failure of planning and leadership. He was scapegoated, demoted in the cabinet, and he fell into a bit of a depression and ended up resigning from the cabinet in November of 1915. I think we're just going to need someone to, don't mind if we can go to the next slide, that would be great. If you're in doubt as to to the effect of this event on Winston Churchill, you saw the photo before, which was a sprightly man in 1911. Well, on the left we have a portrait, which is a self-portrait of his that he painted in 1915, and on the right is one by William Orpen that was done in 1960, and you can see how he aged during that period. One of the interesting things about the Orpen portrait is that William Orpen himself was disgraced at the time, so you had a disgraced painter painting a disgraced subject. One of the reasons why this event was so haunting for Winston Churchill was because he always thought that he was going to die young. He was very much haunted by his father, Lord Randolph, who died aged 45 in 1895. Lord Randolph had resigned rather rashly as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1886. He never held government office again, and he was dead within the decade. And I think we have to ask ourselves whether Churchill felt that in 1915 at the depths of the sort of bottom of his career. So if we can go to another slide. In November 1915, he resigned from the cabinet. The headline of the newspaper tells you what he told Lord Kitchener, that he thought that it was all over, that he would never hold office again. And what's remarkable is that this is 25 years before his finest hour. And so to me, the real question of leadership is that how do you go from this, thinking that it's all over, that you're finished, to, if we can have the next slide, please, to standing on the balcony of Buckingham Palace in 1945 on Lady Day with the King and the Queen, when he was regarded as the saviour of Western civilization. And I'm going to propose to you today that in part, if we can have the next slide, it was his new hobby of painting, which he had taken up in the summer of 1915 at the suggestion of his sister-in-law. Over the course of 45 years, he painted more than 500 paintings. Most of them were in the 1930s during his period of greatest adversity. And although it was just a hobby, he learned new skills and he also fine-tuned others. It also provided him with a place of solace where he could go, where he could regain perspective at difficult times. I believe that it got him through the 1930s and all that adversity, and that it made him more effective in 1940. Painting made him more creative and innovative, but also gave him that sort of place of security that he could find if bold ideas went wrong. And we shouldn't underestimate its importance to him, because he wrote later that painting came to my rescue in a very trying time. If we can have the next slide. In the 1920s, he wrote about his experiences and about the science of painting in a series of magazine articles that were published after the war in this volume, Painting as a Pastime. It was, what he wrote about painting was central to his approach in 1940. He talked about comparing painting to fighting a battle. He advised, when painting, thorough reconnaissance and attentive observation of the scene. And he talked about memory improvement. And if we can go to the next slide, please. And then in 1940, if you think about those things, in 1940 he could have sent anyone to the front to inspect the defences, but he went himself. And I wonder whether he went himself because as a painter, he thought that he would see more, that he would remember more, and that he would be able to recall it more accurately. And you know, when he returned to London, did he paint an imaginary canvas? Did he do that so that he could see the gaps in the defences more clearly and take the decisions that needed to be made in order to make the defence of the realm more effective? You know, and we think about his speeches. You know, a picture tells 1,000 words. Was painting the reason why his speeches and broadcasts became compelling listening, and why it rallied peoples and gave hope to people in occupied and oppressed areas? If we can go to the next slide. Churchill also used painting to achieve political and diplomatic goals and to retain influence. And the most famous moment where painting collided with diplomacy was at Casablanca in January of 1943. This was the conference just between FDR and Churchill to decide on the timing of D-Day, for it to be 1944. And but afterwards, Churchill said to FDR that since he had come all that way from Washington, he needed to see the sun set over the Atlas Mountains in Marrakesh, which was 5 hours across the desert. So they went across the desert there to watch it. Churchill, by all the contemporary accounts, was an excited little schoolboy. FDR was carried to the top of this tower in order to watch the sun go down. And it left a deep impression on Roosevelt, who said that he was very moved by the whole experience. The next day, Churchill, if we can get to the next slide, please. The next day, Churchill waved FDR goodbye at the airport in his dressing gown. And I just wonder today if the President or Prime Minister went off to the airport to say goodbye to the departing head of state or government in their dressing gown, what the press and Twitter would have to say. But he returned to the tower and he painted this picture, which is the daytime scene of what they'd seen from the tower, but it was the only painting that he painted during the war. He gave it to Franklin Roosevelt to memorialize the moment, in the hope, I think, that Roosevelt wouldn't change his mind on the decisions that had been taken in Casablanca, which was something that Churchill had experienced previously. And so the big question for us on this is, did painting somehow help save Western civilization? If we can get to the next slide, please. So, having talked about something that's helped Churchill to become a leader of consequence, let's consider our own lives and consider this, in the context by examining 4 Churchillian principles. So, next slide, please. So the first one's preparation. Obviously, it's important to be in command of the facts, and one needs to know your stuff when you're going about business. Churchill was his own speechwriter. He said very famously that it takes 1 hour of preparation for every minute of delivery. And I think that part of the reason that all of the decisions that he took had a lot of preparation behind them is that when we look back, we see that they were, on the whole, they were seen as effective decisions and that they were thought through. But sometimes, of course, the hardest decision is to take no decision, which he did on some occasions. And so I put it to you, do we take decisions too quickly with too little thought and too little information? And is that why so often we hear people say, why can't we have leaders that we had decades ago? And maybe the reason behind it is that we take decisions too quickly today, whereas they seem more effective because the decisions they took had actually been thought through. Next slide, please. So number 2 is audacity. Churchill was always audacious. If you think about his escape from the prisoner of war camp in Pretoria in 1899, in South Africa, you think about Gallipoli in 1940. This wasn't a man who did things in halves. And obviously, if you want to gain competitive advantage, one needs to be audacious and have a bold plan. And if we're going to compete, if the Western world's going to compete with the emerging economies of the world, we've got to be prepared to take risks, and to take risks means that you need to be audacious. Because ultimately, if we cease to innovate, then we're going to find that we become irrelevant. So number 3, so next slide, please. Once you've prepared that audacious plan, then you have to decide what to do with it. And what you need for that is some courage. And it might be the courage to execute the plan, it might be the courage to change it, but it might also be the hardest thing, which is to abandon it. And courage comes in all forms. It takes courage to stand up and speak, and it also takes courage to stay sitting and listen. But courage ultimately is an essential attribute in a leader of consequence. But courage carries with it an inescapable fact, which takes us to the next slide in number 4, which is the risk of failure. Human nature means that we try to avoid failure. There's a stigma attached to it. But avoiding failure means a lack of audacity and a lack of courage, because, as the slide says, failure is an essential stop on the road to success. And think of any technological innovation that we've seen over the years. There were multiple failures before they reached something that actually worked. And I would challenge you to find a great leader who hasn't endured failure somewhere in their lives. And so today, to be successful, we need to encourage intelligent risk-taking and the ability to learn from failure. And too often today, people make a mistake and they get fired, when actually there's a lot of experience that could be utilised going forward if they were allowed to stay. But like Churchill also, we need a place where we can go to recover when we endure failure, and that by having that place that we can go to, it was painting for him. We put ourselves in a position where we can take those transformational decisions that may end up in failure. And so in short, really, it allows us to become a leader of consequence. But if we can go to the next slide, this is a very interesting quote of something that Churchill said. It might surprise you to see this, and makes me think when I read it, that is this how Churchill viewed his life? Did he see it as a series of failures punctuated by successes? Which is obviously not the prevailing view. But I want to examine this further in the next slide by using a sort of scales of justice of success and failure. And if you look at that, you will see that numerically, and it's not a comprehensive list, but numerically there are more failures there than there are successes. But I'm not suggesting he's a failure, because obviously it scales and you weight it, and clearly his leadership in the Second World War would push it down on the side of success. But the reason I show this slide is because I want to challenge each of you to do this exercise yourselves. And I would say to you boldly that if you find when you do it yourself that there are more successes than there are failures, perhaps you're not being completely honest with yourselves. So if we can go to the next stage of the slide as I wrap up. So just 4 questions for you to ponder. You know, what is your sanctuary? Where do you evaluate failure and regain perspective? What can you learn from your hobbies to self-improve as a leader? And how can you empower your colleagues to become leaders of consequence? And then in the next slide, we have 5 practical tips. Always keep your eye on the goal, but be flexible on the route. Face the facts as they are, not as you would like them to be. Create an environment that encourages intelligent failure, and never conceal the truth from others on your team. Be approachable by creating an atmosphere of kindness, respectfulness, and calm. And finally, humor can reduce tension and inspire greatness. And if we just go to the last slide, I'd just want to end with this charming photograph of Winston and Clementine. I think that it sums up what painting and Churchill's life were all about, which is fun and enjoyment. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions. I'm just going to grab some water, if you don't mind.
And Jennifer, could you ask everyone to please stand with their question and shout it out so that you can hear across the room?
Okay, please stand with your questions and shout it out. Am I the moderator?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Do they need a microphone?
Oh, that's right. They
I
shout it
can
out.
repeat.
Oh, okay, great.
We'll see.
If you just choose, or I can choose, I don't mind.
Yeah, you can choose.
Okay, we're just going to go around from left to right.
Yeah, thanks. Wonderful talk. Thank you. Did you know your great-grandfather, or probably not? And what was it like growing up as a child in that legacy, and how did you know him through, family stories and things like that?
Well, we had a fairly normal upbringing, or I considered it normal. I knew it was privileged, but it was a fairly normal family upbringing, happy family life. I think that what you realize is I'm very, very proud of my legacy. But as I'd say nonchalantly sometimes, it was just an accident of birth. And it has given me, there have been moments in my life where I've met people, been able to go to different places, attend different events that are literally just because of the family that I was born into. And so there's a great privilege that's attached to it. But as my father always used to say to us, there's also a responsibility attached to it. There was a responsibility with, like coming and speaking, at Rotary clubs or other places. People have an interest, and there's a responsibility for me and fellow members of the family to come and do this sort of thing. But also there's the responsibility. He used to tell us all the time that we couldn't go, if we went out, got drunk, smashed up a bar or a restaurant, it would be in the newspapers. And if somebody else, and it would be, Churchill's, Churchill family, relative, smashes up bar. But it wouldn't, but it might not be, it might just be a group of unruly youths, or it might not even make the papers if it wasn't that. So there's the privilege, and there's also the responsibility, and that's how I would, I'm enormously proud of it, but, and I've had lots of fun things I've been able to do. Okay, who's next? The lady there.
I'm just amazed. 500 paintings. I want to know, where are they? Did they stay in the family? He gave to Roosevelt the picture of the view.
Yeah, so
Where's that?
Yeah, so he didn't give away too many. Most of them are at Chartwell, which is his house in Kent in the southeast of England. There's probably about half of them are there, and I would say that now there are probably less than 100 that are still in family hands. But others, have either been sold or they've just been he gave some, or Clementine gave quite a lot away afterwards. So she gave, to a lot of organisations that were connected with him to make sure that they went around. The one that he gave for Roosevelt, and I think one of the interesting things was that paintings that he did give away to some people. And I will just tell you one actually funny story. So he gave a painting to the man who ran the Alpes Maritime region in the south of France. This was in the late 1950s. And when I read all the correspondence around this, I discovered that he hadn't met this guy before. He just gave him the painting. And then about 6 months later, Churchill's private secretary writes to the man who runs the region and said, Sir Winston's coming for an extended period down to the south of France. Could we get a book of petrol ration vouchers? And so quite clearly he used his pictures as currency for something else. So on the picture that he gave to Roosevelt, Roosevelt's son sold it in about 1950, went through a series of different people, and then until about 15 years ago, for about 20 years, it was shoved in someone's closet in New York. The husband had bought it, the husband died, the wife didn't like it, and so it sat in the back of the closet until she died, when it was bought by one Brad Pitt. And we were concerned at one point when Brad and Angelina were going through their difficulties, that we hoped that Solomon's wisdom was not going to prevail in the divorce, but it ended up with her, and she sold it for a monumental amount of money at auction last year. Yeah, we're going to go with it.
Yes.
And thank you for clicking.
No problem. Hopefully a simple question. What were your great grandfather's go-to cigar and go-to whiskey?
Repeat the question.
Well, there were a lot of. I think the Johnny Walker Red Label was definitely his whiskey, and really sort of any Cuban cigar, but he particularly liked the Romeo and Juliet. Yes.
He had a love-hate relationship with France. A lot of people don't know that when France surrendered to Germany, he demanded that they give their navy to England so that Germany would get it. And they refused, and so he sank their ships with sailors on board. But he would leave Clementine in England, and he'd go to the south of France to paint and do things. Well, my favorite quote, you don't know this. He said, when God created the earth, he created one perfect place, France. And he realized he'd made it too good, so he filled it full of French people.
I'm aware that there's a camera sitting there with a red light on. Not sure I should say much, but I will say that that one time when I was going to speak, I can't remember where it was, but my great aunt Mary, who was Winston and Clementine's youngest child, I got a call from her secretary summoning me to go and see her before I left to go and make the speech. And all she wanted to tell me was that, Papa really did like de Gaulle. He really liked the French. And that was basically what, she was, even though I'm not really sure whether that was the case, that was the case. I will say that his state funeral, which his private secretary told me that he had never had any part of it, part of the planning of it, although I have heard stories to the contrary from other people. When, so his body lay in state in Westminster Hall, as you saw with the Queen's funeral, his was the last one like that had taken place in London. And then the gun carriage was pulled to St. Paul's Cathedral, and then down to Tower Pier by the Tower of London, where he went by barge to Waterloo Pier, where he then took the train out to near Blenheim Palace to Blaydon, where he's buried. Now, normally, the logical train station from London to go to if you're going out to the west is Paddington Station. But Churchill knew from his time in the army that there was a junction, in South London where the trains could go from going south to get on, to cross over to go west. And I heard that he had said that he was fine going from Paddington, but if de Gaulle was going to be at the funeral, he must go from Waterloo. And General de Gaulle was at his funeral, and he went from Waterloo. So that might answer your question. Yes, sir.
Two things, if you'll allow me. I hope this story is true, kind of piggybacking on Jess. That when
There's lots that aren't.
when he made his martinis, he would pour his gin, walk across the room, open the vermouth, and consider that enough. Then drink his martini.
I'm not sure that that's true.
So on the second one, I have not seen it, but if you have, how is he portrayed in The Crown this year?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really hard, and people say about Darkest Hour and Gary Oldman that he did a really good job. But part of that is that Gary Oldman spent 7 or 8 hours in makeup, being with a whole mask and everything, being prepared for it. There's lots of portrayals that are good. I mean, I'm not a great fan of the one in The Crown, but you have to sort of get over the fact that it's not a documentary, and I think that too often people, and this is one of the big controversial things that's going on with the new season of The Crown, that people see that and they assume really that it's a documentary, that what's in there is true and that there isn't much in the way of artistic license. I think that people have tried over the years to portray him, and some do it better than others. But
who's done it well?
I mean, I think Gary Oldman did it well. But I think part of that is your brain telling you that you really feel you can see him, as opposed to really that someone who doesn't necessarily look totally like him, that is actually portraying the character extremely well.
Thank you.
Okay, so
this is a tough question because you said you never had an opportunity to meet Officer Winston Churchill. If he were alive today, watching the events around the globe, your take on what he might be feeling and might be sensing given a troubled world.
I have to answer every question. Well, I think that I'm going to stick on safe ground rather than step onto the icy lake. The last thing that he said to the cabinet at his last meeting as Prime Minister in 1955 was stay close to the Americans. And I think that even more so today than 80 years ago, I think that the Americans are the only country that have the military power and just the money to be able. And we're seeing this in Ukraine, and I think that and we saw what happened with the Suez Crisis in 1956-57. When Anthony Eden, Churchill's successor, tried to do something, with the French without telling Eisenhower, without American support. The moment the Americans said, "No, we don't like that," everything came crashing down. So I think that stay close to the Americans is what he would be, and the whole Anglo-American partnership. I mean, he spent his entire life promoting what he called the English-speaking peoples, and I think that particularly the Anglo-American relationship, of which he was an embodiment, because his mother was American, so he was half American by birth.
Thank you.
Okay, so.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting to see you list his failures. Now, some of them we know about. Like you mentioned Edward VIII. There were a couple in there. Just wonder whether you, and then Chancellor of the Exchequer, that was puzzling.
Yeah, well, his time as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1920s was not regarded as a good period of time. He, particularly the decision around the gold standard, was, at the time, it was considered the right thing to do, but in hindsight, it was the wrong thing to have done. And Edward VIII, he was very close to Edward when he was Prince of Wales, and he was just on the wrong side of history. He thought that Edward VIII as king could have some form of marriage to Wallis Simpson and remain on the throne, and he thought the public would be able to wear that. But that was, again, the 1930s were a very difficult period of time. He was wrong on a number of things. I mean, he opposed self-government for India, and then he was warning about German rearmament, and people didn't want to hear that. You had the whole abdication crisis as well. He just looked as though he was just, grasping at straws, trying to find something to be relevant, and was unable to be so. Yes, sir.
Thanks for the great talk. One of the things we see in great leaders is that we tend, particularly because you're so proud of him, that was a hagiographic presentation of his virtues, and that the failures were by and large tactical failures and not personal failures. Could you help us separate fact from fiction and tell us what you believe are the things that were said about him that may have been negative? For example, his vanity and his drinking, and any others that you can think of that you think are representations that might bear some further explanation.
Yeah, I think he, he was accused at the beginning of his career as being a young man in a hurry. Part of that was because his father had died young and he thought he was going to die young. But when you look at, what he wanted to achieve, he told someone when he was at Harrow as a teenager that, England will be, in danger, and I will rescue, I will rescue the country. And you look at what he did when he was in the army, trying to make a name for himself. He sought out conflicts to go and fight in, and then attached himself to some newspaper, wrote articles about, and then wrote books. After that, about his experiences there. So I think that I think he definitely was someone who wanted to be in the limelight, and I think that's probably a fairly fair thing. Even during the 1930s when he was doing stuff, he was doing things in a way that would attract attention. I think that his drinking, he did drink a lot, and he was the first. There was a moment in and he particularly liked champagne, Pont Roger champagne, and in the Second World War there was the laying down of the hull of a ship, and he was with his scientific advisor, Professor Lindemann, and he asked the prof if he would work out, seeing the hull of the ship, how far up the hull it would come if you poured all the champagne that he'd drunk in his life into the hull. And he imagined that, this thing would be like overflowing. And the prof worked it out and told him basically it would be like a little sort of puddle in the corner, to which he was very disappointed. But he did drink a lot. But I don't think that there are any occasions when people could say that he was drunk, or that drinking affected his decision making. He can take it, and he lived till he was 90, smoking cigars and drinking. So his body must have been able to take it. Hopefully, mine can. We've got time for one more. There's a very patient man at the back here who's been putting his hand up for some time.
Thank you. What can you tell us about his views or relationships with Roosevelt and Stalin?
I think the relationship with FDR, he liked him a lot. It didn't start off very well. They had met in 1918 in London at a dinner, and when they then met again during the beginning of the Second World War in 1941, Churchill had forgotten that he had met Roosevelt back in 1918. So things got off to a little bit of a rocky start at that point. But I think it was more. I think Roosevelt liked him, but I think that Churchill liked him more. Stalin, I think Churchill was a little, I mean, he knew that Stalin was dangerous. He knew that he was an evil man, but I think he was somewhat enchanted by him. He used to call him Uncle Joe, and he enjoyed seeing Stalin and enjoyed being with Stalin. But I think he certainly understood. He certainly understood the dangers that Stalin and the Soviet Union under Stalin posed. But I think, on a one-to-one basis, I think he found him quite fun to be with. So,
the one success that kind of stands out is not fitting in is the tank, designing the tank. Or maybe you can explain, is it the painting and the visionary of the painter that he invented the tank? But
the tank, yeah, I mean, the tank wasn't, I mean, it wasn't, it was more other people who actually designed it, although the problem, setting out what the problem was, which was the trenches and the barbed wire, that was where the concept of the tank was. And in fact, I think they called it a land plane originally. But that was, I think that he set out, he saw what the problem was and sort of was like, we need something that can deal with this problem. And then some other people came up with, exactly how the thing would look. I don't think he was sitting there with a napkin and a pen drawing it on. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm never going to talk.
One short question and one other question. Okay. So the first question is the stain where I can't remember who it was, Lady Bird?
Lady Astor.
Lady Astor. Is that where she says, Sir Winston, you are drunk, and he says, and you are ugly, but tomorrow I'll be sober? Is that the true story?
That one didn't happen.
Dang!
Because everybody else is.
Okay. What, I was just giving a gift for you, so be surprised when I get it. What was it that turned his fortunes? I was unaware of all of his failures. So how did he overcome that? What was the moment that put him, onto his success?
Well, I think the moment in public life was, Hitler just raging through Western Europe, and the failure that had taken place in Norway as well, and the Conservative Party in Parliament saying we can't go on with Neville Chamberlain, and there was no one else. They wanted to try Chamberlain's preferred successor would have been Lord Halifax, but they realised they had to have a national government, and the Labour Party under Clement Attlee wouldn't serve under Lord Halifax. The only person who would serve under was Churchill. So really, that was the moment where I think otherwise what would have happened is he would have been seen as someone who peaked early in his career, did a lot of good things, had all these failures in the 1930s. But then everything crystallized at that moment, which is why on the night that he became Prime Minister, as he was walking to 10 Downing Street for the first time as Prime Minister, he turned to one of his aides and he said that I feel like I'm walking with destiny and that all my life has been but a preparation for this hour and this trial.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Very nice. Thank you. So one thing you should take from this is that with Rotary leadership, it's very much like Sir Winston Churchill's. When we're looking for the next president, it generally comes down to, well, there's nobody else. So, 50 years of success. Have a great weekend, everybody. Go Heels.